Join us for the Criterion Institute podcast as Joy Anderson, a global thought leader in business and social change, leads us through a series of discussions, interviews, frameworks, rants, and reframes that will help you better understand how to use finance as a tool for transformative systems change.
I am Joy Anderson, and this is the Criterion Institute podcast. A couple episodes back, I talked about systems opportunities and what it means to be ready when the moment to act arrives. In this episode, I want to push that idea a little further because systems opportunities are not really new. They've been there a long time. What changes is that disruption can make them harder to ignore. We keep describing this moment as one of disruption, volatility, and crisis in politics, in markets, in philanthropy, and in public life. And usually that leads to the same question: how do we stabilize and get back to normal? But I want to ask a different question. What is this disruption revealing? What structures does it expose? What fault lines does it make visible? What has been easier not to see until now? Because the real strategic challenge is not just responding to the event, it's recognizing the system that the event makes visible and being ready to act to change it. And I want to begin this episode with a conversation that opens exactly that kind of question. In the first segment, you'll hear part of a conversation with Rachel Sinha, a field builder, systems change practitioner, longtime friend, whose work has focused on creating the conditions for systems change practice to emerge, connect, and evolve. Rachel reflects on what it means to help build a field of systems change practice and what happens when that field starts to become more established, more connected, and more visible. What I love about this conversation is that it doesn't romanticize field building. It gets into the tension. Who gets to build a field? Whose ideas get legitimacy? What kinds of power shape what gets defined, funded, and recognized? And what happens when the language of systems change starts to reproduce the very dynamics it claims to challenge? That first segment became an entry point to the episode because it points to something bigger. Sometimes the hardest thing is not identifying the change we want. It's being willing to see the systems we are already inside, including the ones that are shaping leadership, field building, and the terms of change itself. So I want to start there with Rachel and then build from that into a broader reflection on disruption, fault lines, and what becomes visible when we are willing to really see the system. So let's get into it.
So when I moved to the US, I saw that there was a field of practice that needed to be built, which was this systems change. Now, when I say that, with a massive caveat, of course, there are a million people already doing system change work in the world, those who call it and don't call it that. But there were lots of people who were running these projects disconnected. But of course, there wasn't a job that I could apply for that was going to give me a systems change field builder role. So what do you do in that environment, right? As an entrepreneur, I started my own consultancy, the Systems Studio, as a studio being, let's experiment with how I can help build the field. And from that came a side project, the System Sanctuary, which was about, building peer learning groups of people who are running system change work. Anyway, I have left that last year, in fact, because I've realized that, in many ways, the field of systems change is now massively connected. There are many people who train people on systems change. There is, a huge amount of people who have been trained in systems change and so now can do that work. So now I'm at the point as a field builder saying, okay, now what, And so there's this interesting thing as a field builder where you're kind of helping for a new field to emerge. And then you're adapting to what now and where can you be of most use now. How do you find that? How
Well,
about
I mean,
you?
I think during that same time, a lot of the work we've done in the last 10 years, well, so maybe stepping back, coming out of the leader shaping markets work, I think like you, I didn't quite see what the pathway was. I mean, you and Cheryl and Michelle and I were all meeting at that time. I think you went forward with a much more concrete initiative, and I couldn't quite see the path. That wasn't, maybe I couldn't see a path I wanted, right? Because there was so much there that was about top-down systems change, right? That if you were in the middle of Gates or you were in the middle of a mid-ER, they were absolutely wanting to draw big systems maps about how everything worked. And I think this is where, you and I are similar in that if it's not changing whose voice matters, it's not changing who we're listening to, then we're just naming systems change as a bigger map of control, right? I don't want to just invest in a company. I want to control the whole market. Okay, put positively, you could say, I don't want to just change through a company. I want to change a whole market. But there was a lot of arrogance in a lot of those approaches that if we have enough money, if we have the right standing, we can. So I think I was a little bit sort of stepping back from that. And went about building the field of gender lens investing, which has taught me a lot. And one of the pieces, and this ties to some of the characteristics that you were talking about, is often to build a field, you need a kind of, maybe it's a singular personality, maybe it's enough chutzpah to keep talking when nobody's listening, a belief, I think there's a level of confidence that it takes to even say, I'm going to talk about systems change. And so, but all of those characteristics run counter to diplomacy, adaptivity, centering care, humility, all the characteristics that you said were a good systems change leader often are counter to the ability to have enough power to sit in a system and be able to change it. So a lot of what I've been watching within the field of gender lens investing and other fields that we intersect with is just really looking at the power dynamics of how we build fields. One of the big ones for us is that in the field of gender lens investing, there's a general fissure where there's a set of people who say there are norms in how finance works, and to be able to get people to do gender lens investing and to have gender matter in finance, which I believe is a form of systems change, you need to talk inside the norms of the system. Well, okay, norms are not fixed. They can change. They came from somewhere. They are often where a lot of the power and the informal power sits. So what if we started and said our challenge was to change the norms of the system? Well, you say you're going to change the norms of the system. The people who benefit from the power in the system benefit from the norms of the system. So this kind of how to analyze what are the power dynamics, not just in the system you're trying to change, but in the conversations about what systems change will work. The system will never change unless we make the business case. Are you absolutely sure that we have to make the business case? Yup. There's no other way to do this. Well, what if there were? What if we changed what the business case was or stopped using that word completely? Why is that the only way we have to do it? And so I think it's similar to some of these we're a think tank. So we end up not involved in activity directly. We get to sit in a similar place to you and watch a lot and just say, wow, that was an interesting set of choices based on what you thought would build the field, based on your analysis of the power dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, I always, I don't know, my approach to it is, so you want to do something about this, brilliant, do it. That's my thing. It's if somebody else is going to take responsibility for what they care about and build something, a piece of infrastructure or a way of working that kind of allows a pluralistic view of like, you know, what this field could be, then bloody go for it, you know, like just do it. And yes, there are power dynamics, but I also feel like I'm going to, you know, I disagree with you. So I'm going to build this over here, which is actually based on my values and what I believe to be true. And of course, the power that is most powerful in field, and I would say, you know, it's creating the conditions for a field to emerge as opposed to field buildings, you know, to the sense that there are already lots of things going on, as I know, you know. So it's like, how are you, you know, how are we going to get money to do our more radical thing over there? You know, and that's often the challenge, isn't it? Because of course, when a foundation's got loads of money and they decide they're going to help a field to emerge, they can do loads of stuff and stuff starts to happen.
I do think there's that pluralism versus harmonization, right? One of the first things that happens in fields is a definitional project so that we can all agree on what we're talking about. Shoot me now, right? Like, because that,
I love it. We can't move forward unless we have a clear definition, and you're just like bingo. It's like bingo cards, isn't it? It's like, okay, we've done it. We've reached our first milestone. Brilliant. Now what are we doing next? Somebody's going to talk about low-hanging fruit and where's the evidence? You know, that's the next one. I really feel like we create such fun bingo cards for film. It's just like then somebody else who really critical about the whole idea comes in 2 years when it's gaining momentum and starts claiming it as their own, writes a piece of thought leadership from extracting from all the people that have been doing the hard work on the ground unpaid. I mean, that's another one.
And all of those, and legitimizes the field because they actually have the voice and the organizational standing that lets, you know, Harvard, whoever, or somebody name this as real. And I take all that lightly. Like for me, I know there's power dynamics. I mean, I'm that's my job. It's my DNA. I see power dynamics everywhere. It's sort of the way I see systems is by tracking power dynamics, right? Like at some level you see who has power, who doesn't. That helps you understand how the system works. But in each of those moments, I think like you, I'm like, okay, that was really interesting how that happened. What do we do now? As opposed to, how dare you take credit? Like, I don't know. I've been part of building 4 different fields now, actively in sort of a leadership role. And I would say gender lens investing, I get an insane amount of credit for that, but I kind of don't want it. Like, like we used to say at the end of our conferences on gender lens investing, please don't ask Criterion what we're going to do next with all these ideas. I don't want to do things with your ideas. I want you to do things with your ideas. Go do them. And the future of the field of gender lens investing, that's really about pluralism. Like we can't all decide that if we just got on board with one idea and one core metric, that would be how it would work. I'm fine if people have that idea, but I'm going to have an idea that says context matters. And we're going to have 2 ideas that exist totally in paradox. And that's life.
Yeah. Let it bloom. That is great. And like, you know, yeah, absolutely. What pisses me off though, what does annoy me is when the obvious, closer to the existing system, in whatever way, it's closer to a business model, it's easier to quantify, it comes from a foundation, you know, it becomes the thing that gets all the air, you know, all the money, all the accolades, all the stuff. And there's other really hardly fought work gone over here, just doesn't get any money, and people are kind of like doing it around the side job. And I mean, that does annoy me. It's funny that you say as well, I mean, that you think about, you see systems in power. I see them in energy. Like I see, where's the energy to move? Like who are the people? Where's the center of, like, we could do something together that we couldn't do alone, and like work with that, which is a different type of power, isn't it? But it's a bit more, I don't know. Yeah, it's a different type of power.
Whether or not they believe, I mean, I think you are right as well. I just think the piece that my brain's always going to analyze is what are the things that they were taught as individuals that let them even believe they could be in a room talking about systems change. There is a privilege to this work that sometimes, and I think it's also about naming, and I think that's the work that you do well, like ending up in places that wouldn't call it systems change, but they're actually looking at all the interconnected pieces, shifting it. That's just life for them. It's not systems change. But if I look at the gatherings around systems change, they are an exercise in privilege, right? They are the people who think they belong in that room. And that's the piece that even in the who's in the room, who can come together, there was a filtering that bugs me.
Yeah, no, same. Lots to say about that.
We keep using the same words for this moment we're living in. Disruption, volatility, crisis, disruption in politics, disruption in financial markets, disruption in philanthropy and aid, and most fundamentally, right, the disruption in the assumptions that people thought they could count on. And usually when we say these words, they pull us towards a certain kind of response. How do we stabilize? How do we protect what we have? How do we get back to normal? But I want to slow that down just for a minute because I'm not really sure the most important question is how do we get back to normal? I think the more important question might be, what is this moment making visible? A few episodes back, I talked about systems opportunities and some insights that I had had about how strategy is not just about having good ideas, but about being ready to act when a real opening appears. I talked about leverage, timing, relationships, and the importance of staying close enough to a system that you can recognize when the moment comes. This episode is connected to that one, but it's doing something just a little different. Because I think systems opportunities are there for a long time. They don't suddenly appear out of nowhere. What changes is that sometimes a disruption makes them harder to ignore. A disruption can expose a fault line. It can make a structure easier to see the power dynamics that drive it. And it can show you who's been carrying the cost of the system all along. So maybe the moment that matters is not just that something happened. Maybe the moment that matters is when something becomes clear and we're ready enough to respond to what we can now see. So that's what I want to explore. Not just disruption as chaos, but disruption as revelation. Not just reacting to events, but noticing what those events are telling the truth about. So what I mean again by a systems opportunity, and I want to make one distinction because I think it matters. A disruptive event is something that happens, a funding cut, a political shift, a climate disaster, a debt crisis, a backlash against gender rights, a sudden market shock. A systems opportunity is something else. It's not just a timely opening. It's not just this issue getting some attention right now. It's something structural, something rooted in how the system is organized and where its patterns, absences, or distortions lie. Sometimes that opportunity has been there for years. But then a disruption happens. And suddenly what was easy to dismiss becomes much harder to look away from. What seems marginal becomes central. What felt abstract starts to look tangible and urgent. So when I say the moment arrives, I don't just mean that an opportunity magically appears. I mean that there are times when the conditions for acting on it become more real. And that's the bridge between this episode and the last one, in which I talked about a very similar set of ideas. The opportunity may already exist. The moment comes when revelation and readiness meet. When something becomes visible enough and we are prepared enough that the structural action that needs to happen for real change to come about is possible. So some examples from our work, because it's easier to understand things when they're more concrete. So one of the clearest places I see this is in our work around gender-based violence. The disruptions are real: rising authoritarianism, conflict, backlash, insecurity, spikes in violence. And if we only look at the level of the event, the response is usually pretty narrow. More services, more grants, emergency support, and those things matter deeply. But when we stay there, we miss something much bigger, because what those disruptions reveal is that gender-based violence is not outside of the system. It's not separate from the political economy. It's not a side issue that sits off to the sides of markets and finance. It shapes labor. It shapes safety. It shapes mobility. It shapes stability. It shapes what kinds of futures are possible. And once you let that in, a systems opportunity comes into view, not just to fund programs, but to change how institutions understand risk, to move GBV into the center of how capital is priced, allocated, and governed, to treat prevention not as a charity, but as part of the financial architecture itself. The crisis didn't create that opportunity. It made an old blindness harder to defend. Second example is financing feminist movements. Here, too, the disruptions are easy to name: shrinking aid, shifting philanthropic priorities, debt pressures, climate pressures, funding precarity. And when we respond only at that level, the questions become, how on earth do we get more money into the system? How do we survive to the next funding cycle? But the deeper issue isn't just scarcity. It's architecture. It's the fact that movements are so often treated as grantees at the far end of the chain, while power sits somewhere else, with intermediaries, with governance structures, with institutions that decide what gets financed and on what terms. So the systems opportunity is not just more funding for movements, it's to build a feminist financial infrastructure, to rethink intermediation, to ask who governs the flow of capital, who sets the terms, and whose logic shapes the system. That feels like a very different question to me, and honestly, the more frank one. A third example is looking at local capital mobilization and really identifying, where does wealth, where does money sit? And the disruptions here are things like currency shocks, fragile banking systems, supply chain breakdowns, global credit tightening, debt pressure. And again, if we only focus on the event, then the response is often, how do we get more outside capital to perform better in difficult conditions? But what this disruption reveals is something else. It reveals just how much local communities are living inside of financial architectures they didn't design and don't control. It also reveals how much financial life already exists locally, often in forms mainstream finance barely knows how to value. Savings groups, remittances, cooperatives, local businesses on Main Street, community relationships, faith-based networks, public and informal systems that carry far more of the economy than they're given credit for. So The systems opportunity here is not just to channel more money into a place. It's to treat local actors as financial architects, to design vehicles anchored in place, to shift governance, to stop treating communities as the last mile and start seeing them as people who understand the system from the inside. So if these systems opportunities are there, why do we miss them? I think one reason is that disruption is loud. It creates urgency, it creates fear, it creates pressure to reassure people. It creates demand for fast answers and visible control. And all of that pushes us towards event thinking. How do we control the damage? How do we restore stability? How do we get through this quarter, this election, this budget cycle? And yet, again, those are not bad questions, but they're incomplete. Because sometimes the system that looked stable was only stable because certain people were absorbing the cost of that stability. Communities, movements, informal workers, local institutions, peoples whose losses don't show up clearly in the metrics powerful institutions prefer. And when disruption exposes that, we have a choice. We can treat it as temporary volatility and try to patch the surface, or we can treat it as evidence of how the system actually works. And that's the part I keep coming back to, because once you see the fault line, once you see whose labor, whose safety, whose time, whose futures have been carrying the hidden cost, then business as usual stops feeling neutral. It becomes a choice. And that choice is strategic, but it's also moral and political. So what does it mean to respond structurally instead of reactively? I think it usually means moving in a few different directions. First, it means changing what we consider material, bringing into the center what has been treated as peripheral, whether that's gender-based violence, care, child well-being, local knowledge, community trust, movement strength. And second, it actually means looking hard at the structures that make systems work. In our financial world, that's intermediaries. And that's not just about who gets the money, but who shapes the terms, who governs the vehicle, who holds the power to define what's investable or legitimate. Third, it means questioning mandates. Sometimes the problem is not only a lack of resources, it's that institutions have defined their job too narrowly. It's that institutions have defined their job too narrowly. They've decided in advance what risks count, what outcomes matter, and what kinds of value are visible. And fourth, it means shifting who gets understood as an actor. Moving communities, movements, and local institutions out of the category of beneficiary and into the category of designer, strategist, builder, investor, governor. And this is where readiness comes back in, because once something becomes visible, what happens next depends on whether we are ready to act on what we now know. Do we have the analysis? Do we have the relationships? Do we have the language? Do we have the credibility? Do we have the courage to argue for a more structural response when the pressure is so strong to just smooth things over and move on? So I want to leave you with practice. Think about one disruption you're living with right now, one real thing, something specific. And then ask yourself, what is this revealing that was already true, but was easier to ignore than it is now? Who's been carrying the hidden cost of the old arrangement? What systems opportunities become more visible if I treat this as structural evidence, not temporary instability? And what would that require from me now? And what would readiness for this moment require from me now? What relationships, what conversations, what language, what courage? Because maybe the real work is not just getting better at responding to disruption. Maybe the real work is letting disruption teach us how to see the structure, to see the fault lines, to see what's been normalized, to see what's been hidden in plain sight. And then, when clarity and readiness come together, to act. And so I want to thank you for being willing not just to weather disruption, but to ask, what is it revealing and what becomes possible when we are finally willing to see?
For over 20 years, Criterion has been shaped by the people who showed up, curious, committed, and willing to learn how finance can be used to shift systems and advance gender equality. There's more than one way to work with us, and we've created volunteer opportunities for different types of contributors. One way is through the Criterion Fellowship. The Criterion Fellowship is a structured voluntary program that offers deep learning, access to our tools and frameworks, and the opportunity to contribute to real, meaningful work alongside of our team. The value is real. Learning how systems change actually happens, access to people and ideas shaping the field, and the chance to help more people see finance as a tool that they can use. If you don't know us already, your first step is to start showing up at our events. Our events are interactive learning spaces where you can join in conversations and contribute where your curiosity and capacity align. We believe in porous boundaries. People come closer for a season, step away for a time, and return in new ways. Some want structure and immersion. Others want to engage more informally. All of it matters. We work to expand what is seen as possible for using finance as a tool for social change. We would love to work together with you. If you're drawn to the work, come learn with us. Come contribute, come be part of the work that matters.
To learn more about our work, visit us at criterioninstitute.org. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Your reviews help our podcast reach a wider audience. Thanks for listening.